So I read this whole article so that I could go through this a little more coherently because it's a bit of a long one, okay? But when it got emailed to me, I was curious because the name of, like, the headline is strange to me. The Revolt of the Christian Homeschoolers. Like, what are they talking about, right? So basically, and this is just some story that you have no actual line to figure out if this is how it actually happened or if they're trying to make you feel emotionally connected. Point is, this man and this woman were raised as a very hard-line conservative Christian family and in that kind of setting with a homeschool system. And part of their upbringing, they were taught that if you're not homeschooled and you're going to the government schools, that the government schools are indoctrinating you. They're swaying you to Satan and pulling you away from God. They're pulling you away from your family, and they're making you into a type of person that you really should not be striving to be. And this is their daughter, who they decided to enroll in public school, going against the grain in the way that they were raised their entire lives. Okay, that's the summary of the event of their whole rebellion, is that they started enrolling their kids in public schools and being involved in the public school system. So, was it this one, I think? Over the past 3 years, American interest in homeschooling has soared, which it has because of COVID, right? During the whole pandemic thing, it had a huge uptick. In this series, the Washington Post will explore how that rise is transforming the nation's educational landscape and the lives of hundreds of thousands of children who learn at home rather than at traditional school, which is just public schools. Many parents say home education empowers them to withdraw from schools that fail their children or provide instruction that better reflects their personal values, which is true. This isn't something that's just wrong and made up. This is a part of where what these people were raised to believe is actually accurate. If you're going to the public school, they are indoctrinating you to a specific doctrine that is passed down in public schools. The same way that if you are homeschooling, you are indoctrinating your children to a doctrine that you prescribe to. That's it. It's indoctrination either way. It's just a matter of who's doing it and to what set of values. Okay? So there's little to no regulation of homeschooling in much of the country, with no guarantees that kids are learning skills and subjects to prepare them for adulthood, or for that matter, learning anything at all, which isn't true. This is a factual lie. Like, this is a fallacy. There's numerous different programs you can take your kids through to homeschool them. They still go through standardized testing. Like, you still sign them up for the standardized testing to make sure that they learn stuff. The thing is, if you're homeschooling them, you're able to cater to their needs and around your own schedule. So you're able to set things up differently, right? You don't have to, and if you have, like, let's say you have a kid with ADHD, instead of them being the kid that gets left behind because the teacher's focused on the other 28 kids in the class, you can make sure your kid gets the attention they need because you can schedule and organize your lesson plans in a way that caters to the way that their mind works and absorbs information. Although, I'm sure plenty of people who go through this don't go through a single one of the programs. They don't care to actually buy any of the books that you would need to teach your kids from, and they actually just spew garbage at them all day long. Homeschooled children have attended Ivy League schools, but we don't know that they are learning anything. They've won national spelling bees, but once again, we don't know that they're learning any skills. They've also been the victims of child abuse and severe neglect, which is true. So are kids that go to public schools. This isn't like, this is why I want to talk about this, is because, like, look at the way they're framing this to make it seem like homeschooling is some terrible, horrible thing. Some are taught using the classics of ancient Greece, others with Nazi propaganda. Who's teaching their kids Nazi propaganda? Like 0.001% of the population? Okay. Like, they constantly push this whole racism thing, like being racist is this huge prevalent issue in the country, whereas when I was a kid, we all took what Martin Luther King Jr. had to say pretty seriously when he said, I have a dream that my children will grow up in a world where they are judged by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin. Here we are with everybody focused on fucking race again, because, you know, that's not how you create racism or anything. The level of just ignorance toward the entire topic is maddening. Yeah, indoctrination's used as a big scary word. You're right. Kids kind of have to learn, is learning, of course. Values are attached. Humans aren't impartial. Exactly. So when you have homeschooling, you're imparting your set of, like, morals and beliefs in your kids, right? When you send them to a school for 8 hours a day to do it, you're giving them the government's set of morals and obligations and priorities and indoctrination based on not just the government, really, but based on the ideology of the educators. So the school board, the individual teachers, the principal at the school. It's not necessarily the politics. It's the people in charge of the schools who are doing it. Which, if you look at it, they're almost all left-leaning. So, of course, it would seem that people that are conservative are going to do this as some sort of conspiracy, if you want to spin it that way, to create some framework of creating this disingenuous dislike for the thing. Because you can just use the word conspiracy the way they use indoctrination. Like some scary word that makes it seem like kooky people out there just throwing noodles at a wall hoping it sticks to say it's done cooking. Like, the fact is, you go to college to get your teaching degree, and you're in college surrounded by professors who are teaching classes on social justice, and they think that they're going to not be sending teachers out to schools that are very left-leaning, and that might not jive right with like about half the country, really more than half the country, because you have, it's not split down the middle half and half. It's not more heavily leaning one way or the other. Anyway, Christina and Aaron were supposed to advance the banner of that movement, instilling its codes in their children through the same forms of corporal punishment once inflicted upon them. Keep in mind, these people were raised in like the 80s, right? Like, they're about my age, maybe a little older. So they're like early to mid 80s, I'd say, is when they were born and when they were being raised. People today don't raise their kids the same way. Just because you were raised that way doesn't mean you're going to raise your kids the same way, like with the same kind of discipline. And like all rebellions, this one came with consequences. You mean like all decisions? Every decision you make has consequences, good and bad. Congratulations. And then it goes into like some, oh, well, you know, they created problems with the family because their parents really don't like it, and they were raised to not look at the public school system as being a good system and only being there to indoctrinate people. And it goes through like how they go through the whole thing. And then you get down into this, the Joshua generation. So this is where they actually start diving into the whole homeschooling being a Christian conspiracy thing, right? So In Virginia, there was a surge where nearly 57,000 children were being homeschooled in the fall of 2022. Like I said, after the pandemic in 2020, there was a huge upswing in homeschooling in America because teachers having to teach courses remotely and over whatever programs they were using, Zoom or whatever, to teach their classes to their students. Parents found that this wasn't something they were okay with. A lot of parents also found, because they'd just sit, on the other side of the camera. So teacher seeing what you're seeing here, but say I'm the child and you're the teacher, and my parents just sitting right over here where you can't see my hand now, but they're hearing everything that the teacher's saying to you. They caught these teachers teaching their kids things that they have no reason to be talking to their kids about. Like, for instance, Florida has the entire controversy of the Don't Say Gay bill, which isn't what it is at all. There's nothing about it. All that bill was saying that teachers in public schools should not be discussing their personal relationships, their sexual preferences, their sexual actions or sexual conduct with children younger than the age of like 8 or 10. I forget what the age was. And they decided this is the Don't Say Gay bill in the media to make people upset. But these are the types of discussions that people caught these teachers having with their kids. Little children. It's disgusting. Yeah, it might have been the third grade here is about eight or so. Fifth grade is about 10, depending on what month you're born. So, yeah, it's about third grade, yeah. Which, like I said, like why should an elementary school teacher who's teaching kids who are in third grade or about 8 years old or so, why should they be having a discussion with those children about how their homosexual relationship has taken a sexual decline? There's no reason for this. And because parents were running into this, recording it, and putting it on the internet, a lot of parents said, you know what, I'll teach them my fucking self. Because you don't have the right to teach my kids this shit. So they took it upon themselves to correct it. And people are upset. Practices roots in countercultural left took on a very different character among conservative Christians. Homeschooling became a tool for binding children to fundamentalist beliefs they felt were threatened by exposure to other points of view. Now, that is quite the accusation, because the fact of the matter is, a practice with roots in the countercultural left. When has the left ever been Christian in our country? It really hasn't. They've always pointed to the Republicans and been like, oh, those Christians, they're stupid. Oh, these guys, they're dumb, they're ignorant, blah, 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 blah. Ridiculous. And once again, a tool for binding children to fundamentalist beliefs they felt were threatened by exposure to other points of view. It's not necessarily that they felt this way, it's the fact that the indoctrination of the public school systems, which removed the Bible from their teachings, contradicted the things that these parents wanted to teach as Christians. Congratulations, in America you have freedom of religion. If a Christian parent wants their child to be raised in a Christian way and wants that to be part of their education, congratulations. They have every right to do so here. This is legitimately the Washington Post trying to slap your religious freedom in the face and say, you're just threatened by the exposure of other points of view for your beliefs to exist. Which is laughable, because this entire article is them throwing a punch at homeschooling because homeschooling threatens their ability to indoctrinate your children to their points of view. It's hilarious the way that this works, because they're trying to convince you that you shouldn't homeschool your kids because it'll make them into Christians, right-leaning Christians, conservatives, right? Conservative Christians is what it's going to, homeschooling supposedly going to create, because you've removed them from the exposure of the left-leaning views. That's literally the argument throughout the entire article. It's crazy that this is how they do this. Couldn't the other side have the exact same complaint? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's my point. That is exactly my point, is that they're going through this entire thing in the article trying to be like, well, you're doing it this way. Like, but you're arguing that they shouldn't do that and instead should use your system that you have control of. It's absolutely ridiculous to me, because they're complaining about it in a way that's designed to make you feel like your kid is at risk of becoming a Christian conservative, like that's going to be the downfall of the country in some way. Like, it's not. It simply isn't. It's wild that this is the way that they go through this, and I'll get into why it's wild later, because it's absurd to me. What's the name of this? The HSLDA. So Michael Ferris is the founder of the HSLDA, which is a organization, which is this guy. It's an organization that has done a lot of the legwork on creating an actual foundation for homeschooling to be viable and capable, and legally defended the ability for parents to homeschool their children in this country instead of sending them strictly to public schools. So he did it from the position of a conservative Christian who holds these views of a radical Christian conservative. You need to have your kids believe this way. You need to raise them like this. And he does have some radical views. Congratulations. If you want to be free and live in a free society, this is part of what the cost of that is. You're going to have people who use their freedom in a way that they believe is best. He believes that that kind of living and that kind of raising your children is the best way to do so. You don't have to agree. But through his work, he is still actually allowing you to raise your kids how you would like outside of the public school system on your own. It's crazy that they want to frame this all negative. I don't understand how they get away with this so often. Homeschooling today is more diverse demographically and ideologically than it was in the heyday of conservative Christian activism, yet those activists remained extraordinarily influential. It's not that they're influential, it's that a lot of the programs for homeschooling that exist outlined by them, right? That's where they came from. They outlined it. A lot of the legal work that has been done to protect the ability for you to do this was done by them. It's not that these people have some sort of crazy influence over what you're doing if you homeschool your kids. In fact, you can go through these programs for homeschooling that are available here, and if you do not want to include some of the more Christian aspects that they have in their curriculum, they offer you within their curriculum and suggested books and things of this nature for you to teach your kids alternatives. So you could say, you know what, I don't really want to teach them these things out of the Bible. It's not my thing. And you could go with one of the alternatives. You could even be like, you know what, I don't read the Bible. I'm not a Christian, so I'm not going to read that for them. However, we'll spend time where your curriculum says to study the Bible, and we'll instead study Buddhism because maybe you're from Asia or something and you're Buddhist. For whatever reason, you're Buddhist, and that's your leaning. You can do that too. This entire thing is just to make you feel like they're attacking you from a Christian stance on the right. They constantly connect conservative Christian with something negative in the entire article because they want you to connect Christians and conservatives to negative. And they also want you to connect Christian conservative activists and this culty kind of conspiratorial end of it into being all that it is, which is wild. Former homeschoolers have been at the forefront of those arguing for greater oversight of homeschooling. Yes, because a lot of them don't know what to do to go through the program well. A lot of them aren't very well educated, and they don't know how to set up these plans and how to do it in the best way. The fact is, this isn't a very old program. It started maybe about 40 years ago in the U.S., because it really kicked up in like the 80s and 90s for homeschooling. It's when this organization began, was in the 80s, and it's still very young in how it works, and there's a lot of factors to take in when you're doing this. And people who want to homeschool need help figuring out how to do it. See, and here's the thing too, right? As an adult, I can say no. What happened to me as a child was wrong. You could homeschool your kids differently. You don't have to raise them with the strictness that they were raised with, which I believe is down right in here somewhere. Fair said it's not uncommon for children who grow up in oppressively patriarchal households to reject or at least moderate their parents' beliefs. However, he said such families are a minority in the homeschooling movement and are often considered extreme even by other conservative Christians, which is sensible. Because even if you're in a matriarchal household, the same thing will happen. If you're in a single-parent household, the same thing will happen. This is just the way humans develop from childhood to adulthood. You're going to take some of what your parents do, and you're going to reject the rest of it. That's the way it is. And as a parent, you should be hoping your children do this. You should be hoping that your children look at the things that you do and go, that's a really good quality. I want to be more like that. This part, however, is a really negative quality, and the way that it's impacted me has been detrimental. So I want to do less of that. That way your children are better than you moving forward. That should be the goal. It's specifically a system that is set up to hide the abuse. At some point you become so mentally imprisoned you don't even realize you need help. If you're in an abusive environment, this is the situation you're in. And this is a quote from the mother of the people who were rebelling. Now, the thing is, this was strictly because of how she was raised. This is how her parents were. This is how her parents went about discipline. You don't have to do it. This can be legitimately one of those things you reject and do better. You don't have to do it that way. The system doesn't operate that way. That's how your parents operated. It's how your parents operated. It's how the people they were around operated. So it's the entire group of people you were surrounded by, which, as I said, is on the fringe end of this spectrum. Like, these people weren't in the moderate spectrum of the homeschooling group. This is a fringe portion of it that takes this very radical religious view and implements it into the way that they do this. It's a very fringe type thing, and I mean, you could argue that people who do this are also Amish people, right? Because they very much so are raised homeschooled without very much education in many cases. And their whole society within our society is very much so hidden with the majority of what goes on within it. Uh, see, like this. Aaron had grown up believing Christians could outpopulate atheists and Muslims by scorning birth control. That's because of the way his parents raised him. That has nothing to do with religious belief. That is legitimately upbringing. Christina had been taught the Bible-based arithmetic necessary to calculate the age of a universe less than 8,000 years old, which you can do through the Old Testament because it tells you how old everybody is, right? So you could go and do it that way. The thing is if you also consider the Old Testament is measured by men in relation to the way they interpret what is said to them by an eternal, ever-living God, I think that the two beings between a human being that's mortal man and a God who's immortal may not interpret the passage of time in the same way. Their education was one in which dinosaurs were herded aboard Noah's Ark. Where the hell did they get that? This is not included literally anywhere in any Bible. This is literally just fringe religious wildness, and in which the penalty for doubt or disobedience was swift. Sometimes they still flinched when they remembered their parents' literal adherence to the words of the Old Testament. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. Now, I'm going to point this out. I actually pulled this up. This comes out of Proverbs chapter 23, verse 13. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, and shalt deliver his soul from hell. Like, this whole thing, first of all, if you want to understand this one little verse, you have to read the whole thing for context. And you'd have to understand that this was literally written down and believed at a period in time where the odds of your child living to the age of 10 were very low. The odds of your child being attacked by another adult and facing like enslavement or being just completely obliterated by somebody for being from another nation or speaking another language or looking different was incredibly possible because of the time and the way society was. It's not the same anymore. Not to mention the fact that this Proverbs, that's Old Testament. So then I went to Proverbs 19, right? So 4 chapters earlier, verse 18. Chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. So they're telling you to discipline your child how you need to, and if it makes him cry, you shouldn't be separating your soul for that. Like, you shouldn't allow it to harm your soul. Like, the depth of your being to discipline your child because your child needs to be disciplined. This doesn't mean you have to beat the shit out of your kid. It just means you have to discipline them. Some kids, all you have to do is tell them, you're making me upset. And they'll break down. Like, they don't like it when you're upset. That's enough. Some kids will not listen to you at all until you instill some more, I don't know, some more strict or more punishing discipline to their actions. It's the way it is because everyone's different. It's the way it goes. But to act like this is how all people who are part of homeschooling because of this fringe movement within it, like this fringe group within homeschooling, is crazy. That's like saying everybody who believes that you still need to be wearing a mask to prevent coronavirus, even though the CDC has stated that it's basically the flu and we need to treat it as such, is mentally incapable of being in charge of their financial decisions. You see how crazy that shit sounds? It's the same kind of crazy thing to just draw a line to. So then they go through breaking the child's will, because this was what the mother had written down as her goals for a family and what she was looking for in a husband at one point, right? Because, you know, she wanted to have a traditional Christian nuclear family household where he made all the money and she raised kids and they had the same ideals and religious views. I don't know why that's something that they framed as like some negative thing. This is like, why would you want to have a relationship with somebody who doesn't have the same worldview as you? That, like, it wouldn't work. Like, that, it's crazy to think that that is something that they tried to demonize. Is that she had that worldview at that point in time, as if she couldn't have possibly grown and changed over time. It's ridiculous. So then they have chastisement, and this is from, where was it, during courtship? So this is taken from like some group thing they went to at their fringe religious group for like before they got married, to make for like marriage counseling, pre-marriage or whatever, right? And how they had this discussion about, oh, I don't know if I could discipline my children because I'd love them too much. And it's like, oh, yes, you can. You have to do it, and blah, blah, blah. And it's, you do. You need to discipline your kids. He knew that the term parents in the movement, casually used for discipline, spankings, did not capture the childhood terror of being struck several times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. Like, because you don't need to strike your kid all the time. Your kid might be a kid who refuses to listen, and maybe you have to give him a swat on the ass. One swat on the ass, not even hard, just enough to make him go, oh, fuck, I'm not paying any attention to you. I almost did something that got me killed. Now I'm going to listen because you swatted me on the ass, so I'd pay attention to you. Like, doesn't even have, they can literally be like that, because it's the noise. It's the noise in your physical contact with them that got their attention. It doesn't have to be hard at all. It's ridiculous. Oh no, I definitely deserved all my discipline as well. I did. The thing is, I know people who got legitimately beat. I didn't get beat like that, but I know people who got beat. And it's not constructive at all. Some kids need a spank. Some kids need it. Some kids don't. We're not all the same. You can't just have some cookie cutter method and it works with everybody, because we're all different. If we were all the same, we wouldn't have disagreements. This wouldn't be a problem. This wouldn't be a news article if we were all the same. So it's the way that they go through the whole article is like this, just over and over and over again. And then it discusses how they go through this whole thing, their kids going to school now, and she enjoys it, and the parents had some issues to get over that they call trauma because of everything. That's really not trauma. It's just they had issues with feeling comfortable in the school setting, right? And then how they're having issues with maintaining a relationship with their parents because of their parents' views on schooling and how this has gone. So it baffles me that this is the way they do this, because the Washington Post here in the U.S. is a left-leaning news source. Okay, the things that they do tend to come out left-leaning, which here is the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party has also been saying, and the Washington Post has printed out several articles discussing how teachers need paid better. But then they also talk about how public school teachers make more money than private school teachers. How do you figure that? How do you figure that a school that's getting paid public funds and is paying teachers maybe $12 an hour to start, which is insanely low, is paying less money to the teachers than the private school? And they go through and they post their findings on it, but the thing is they aren't looking at all public schools and they aren't looking at all private schools. They're looking at the lowest paid private schools versus the highest paid public school teachers. And that's where they came up with their entire thing for those articles, to say that these teachers make more money at a public school, because then it made it seem like, and in those articles, it was designed to make it seem like the public school was going to be the better place to send your kids because the teachers get paid more, so they have more fucks to give about your child's education. Which isn't true. It's just factually not true. If it was true, then public schools would have a higher success rate of kids going on to college and having successful financial lives and having their shit together. Not private schools. Private schools hold that. So it's a very misleading thing. So you have the Washington Post making articles like that. This article, you have them saying all these things about how public teachers deserve more money, but hey, they're making more money than private schools. Supposedly, you shouldn't be homeschooling your kids. You shouldn't be using private schools. You should send them to the public schools. Why should you send them to the public schools? Because people like the Washington Post help pay the lobbying companies that go to the schools. They're part of the same organization, essentially. They have ties. It's absurd the way that they try to act like this is just some random thing, and it's so terrible for your kid to be conservative or right-leaning because they're being homeschooled, and if you're homeschooled, that's what they're going to be, which is crazy as fuck. Fact is, you should be able to homeschool your kids. You should be able to raise your kids how you see fit. You should be able to teach your kids the morals and lessons you think are important for them to know. There's a certain amount of things and information that your child should have to be taught. There's a certain amount of mathematics that your child should have to know. There's a certain amount of history that your child should have to know. Like, if you're living in America, you should have to know some things about American history. Like, I don't know, the reason that we wrote the Declaration of Independence, the reason that we wrote the Bill of Rights, the reason that we wrote the Constitution, the reason that we fought the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War. You should know about civil rights movement. You should know about Jim Crow laws. You should also know about how slavery, the way it's taught in public schools, is not accurate at fucking all. The only slavery that public schools teach you about in this country that I've ever experienced. This includes me being in college taking classes that discuss slavery and American history. This includes me being in just public school learning these same lessons. They do not teach you about the fact that the first person in the American U.S. colonies to own slaves was a black man who had Irish slaves. That was the first slave owner in the U.S. They don't teach you the fact that during the Civil War, the majority of slave owners in the South were black. And they try to wash this out by saying, oh, well, that's because they were buying their friends and family to set them free. Then why were they fighting the Civil War? Like, the slaves that were freed following the Civil War were primarily owned by other black people in the South. They don't teach this accurately at all. It's completely inaccurate. So why is it that they think you should be taught this inaccurate version of history instead of just history? Why is it that they want you to learn critical race theory which is a specific teaching of history through a specific lens of also teaching you, well, maybe you shouldn't like little Jimmy because little Jimmy he was born with light skin, even though he's not white. But that clearly means that he's mixed. So little Jimmy is part white, so he's got partial white privilege. And little Chong, his parents came here from Japan. And while his parents were in internment camps in the 30s, we're just, not going to discuss that so much. We're going to breeze right over it. We'll mention it once or twice, but we're not really going to teach it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to teach you that he has a lot of privilege in this country and a lot of rights, because Asian Americans have the highest demographic for being monetarily, educationally, and business-wise successful in this country. Like their business endeavors, their educational endeavors, and their monetary efforts tend to be the most successful. You want to look across America to figure out what demographic holds the most wealth? Asians. It's Asians. You want to look at it through that lens? There you go. But then also, we're going to champion things that empower black people and give them more rights and more capabilities. We're not going to mention the fact that these types of laws discriminate in favor of black people, because this is a reparation for things like slavery, the way that we teach it in America to drive a racial divide amongst people who did not experience slavery. So we're going to sit here and use this as a divide, even though it's actually meant as a reparation of forms to allow black people who hold a lower educational standard on a test to gain access to a school over an Asian who does way better on the test. But that's the way the system's set up to work. But they act like that is somehow necessary. And the way they frame it is the way that I just said it, which for me feels disgusting coming out of my mouth, because I hear it and I hear the blatantly obvious racism behind it. And because of my pasty ass white flesh, it will come across people who listen to this as a racist statement. But if I were black and made the exact same statement, it'd be like, yeah, you're right, man. You're right. Because of the way that it's been framed by people like the Washington Post, who want you to hate each other. It's disgusting. Well, yeah, there are people who shouldn't teach kids, and the fact is, in this country, there are plenty of people who shouldn't teach kids who do. I'm not going to name schools, and I'm not going to name names, but I know for a fact that there are schools in this country that have teachers who do not have degrees in teaching at all. In fact, a lot of them have absolutely useless degrees. For instance, I know people with political science degrees who minored in something like math or history. Like that was their minor in a 4-year degree. They go and get a job at a school as a teacher. Don't ask me how, because I don't understand why that works. Other than, they have the right views, so that it's good indoctrination for the process. So they get these jobs as teachers in these schools. They're making maybe $12 an hour starting, like I said, which is nothing. It's not enough. But here at the same time, these schools are going to tell your kids the crazy bullshit that I just said. They're going to teach them that that's the way that history is. They're going to teach you that the transatlantic slave industry is American evil. They're not going to mention the fact that these were tribes in Africa that had typically lost a battle or a war with another tribe in Africa, and the tribe that won sold the tribe that lost to the Portuguese or the Spanish, who then brought them to South America or Central America and eventually North America. It was predominantly South and Central America. So they completely ignore that, but they'll frame it in a way that makes it seem like they all came here, which isn't necessarily true at all. It's ridiculous. Meanwhile, because they're happily teaching that at the same school, mind you, these are schools in the U.S., these kids are learning 3 languages. Now, I don't know why they're learning 3 languages, but they are. What are the languages they're learning? Well, they learn English, because that's the American language. We speak English. Imagine that. Now, it would make sense to say, well, after English, we teach them Spanish. We want them to be bilingual and know Spanish because a lot of Americans speak Spanish, and we share a border with Mexico, and a lot of Hispanic and Latin immigrants come here, and they're a huge portion of our society and economy, and it would make it easier for us to communicate with each other if we could understand Spanish. Spanish isn't one of the languages they teach. They teach English, Russian, and Mandarin. Why the fuck are they teaching you Russian and Mandarin? What is the benefit to you learning Russian and Mandarin at these schools? Well, I just a little bit of research on these schools and come to find out they were being funded and put in place by multinational corporations. And when you tried to track down these multinational corporations, it was just shadow companies. They were all shadow corporations, just shell companies. Which, you just keep following the money, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, it ties back to China and it ties back to Russia. Gee, I wonder who's trying to indoctrinate your children. But hey, you should send your kids to the public schools. Don't teach them yourself. Don't be concerned about what your kids are learning. We need to be all upset about how in Florida they're banning books, which isn't the case. He didn't ban any books. He just removed certain books from schools because your children shouldn't be in school reading books that are pushing a trans agenda through pornography. Literally having in these books graphic images I'm not going to pull up because it disgusts me, of children animated like a comic as a little boy playing with a little girl, but the little girl has a strap on and is teaching the little boy how to do oral. As just one example of what's in some of these books that are being banned from school premises. It's not like these are just being outright banned and burned. They're being removed from schools because your kids shouldn't have access to pornography. It's illegal. It's child pornography. It's not a legal thing, so he removed it from the school library. He made it so teachers couldn't make it something that is part of their curriculum to teach your kids. But they frame it as some terrible thing. It's kooky the way this works. And people need to be very careful about it. When I read articles and when I watch news stuff, I tend to look for the way they talk about the people that they're discussing. Because if you read this article, if you go look this article up and you read it, they're talking about this family that has decided to involve their kids in public schools very positively and brave, while also framing their entire past as something that is cult-like, abusive, abhorrent, ignorant, uneducated, like they're not a capable family of taking care of their children financially because they don't have skills that they clearly have, right? Like they go through this whole thing, and if the news is trying to berate, belittle, besmirch, discredit, or defame people or groups, the article or the story is likely propaganda. It's a psychological warfare effort, and it's propaganda. And I say this as somebody who is trained in psychological warfare. Like, you do these things to undermine people and to wear out the foundation of what they believe, to usurp certain ideologies and belief systems, to install your own ideologies and belief systems, to place trust within your systems, to remove your own capability and place it in another spot. Not to mention the fact that by doing this, like, if your kid spends 8 hours a day at school just to learn and then lunch, right? And then your kid also spends another 2 hours at school for like a club, like an anime club or a video game club, or playing on a football team or a baseball team or wrestling or whatever it may be. There's another 2 hours. There's 10 hours of their day. They're sleeping for about 8 hours, right? You've got their curfew or their bedtime or whatever, and then they get up and then they go to school. That's about 8 hours, plus their 10 hours at school with their extracurricular activities. So there's 18 hours of the day. Your kid has 6 hours of the day left. Well, going off of when I was at school, here in the U.S. at a public school, every day my teachers, according to their curriculum and the pamphlets they would hand out at back to school nights for my parents to have, and their syllabus for classes, you could expect to have anywhere from 1 to 4 hours of homework every day, to include your weekend. Your weekend would actually be 6 to 10 hours of homework. So let's just shoot in the middle and say it's like 3 hours. Now there's 13 hours where they're consumed with school shit. So they're dealing with your teacher's ideology and what the teachers are teaching them and telling them and pushing on them for about 13 hours out of the day. That's more than half the day already. 8 hours of sleep. There's 21 hours out of the day. You get 3 hours of the day, assuming your kids aren't doing, I don't know, any of their own kind of shit to calm down or do something. Like, I would have been skateboarding. I wouldn't have been home aside from like, okay, it's almost dinner time and then I'm going to go to sleep. Right? Like, I wasn't hardly around my parents at all outside of here and there. I was doing my own shit. I was out at concerts. I was hanging out with my friends. I was going skateboarding. I wasn't spending that 3 hours with my family. I was out doing my own shit. At what point in time do you get to raise your own kids? How is that anything other than indoctrination if your public school system is responsible for nearly every waking hour of that child's life 5 days a week? How is that not indoctrination? Not to mention the fact that at home, the parents are expected to discipline the kids for poor grades, needing to get their chores done, needing to make sure they take care of themselves and they're doing like their hygiene and everything, right? So your parents are negative interaction, negative interaction, negative interaction, negative interaction. Your teachers are educating you, they're teaching you, they're encouraging you, because that's what they're doing at school all day long. It's positive interaction. That makes for a very, very well-placed and strategic indoctrination program, is what that does. Because your kid is going to be more likely to adopt the ideas and perspectives of somebody who gives them that kind of a relationship than the person who comes home and says, why the fuck haven't you gotten your homework done yet? Why is it that these dishes are dirty? Why is your room a mess? You need to take a shower. You smell like shit. Why haven't you picked up the dog shit? Go take the dog on a walk right now. What are you doing? Hey, don't forget to take the trash out. That's not going to instill any of that ideology at all. Exactly. It all wants to be a mess. Everything wants to be a mess. The whole situation of this is a mess as well, because that's pretty much what the world is. It's just one big mess, and everybody's trying to make their own way through it. Like, I just find it disgusting when I get sent articles like this to my email that's legitimately just, we're going to undermine people's freedom of religion and freedom of choice because you have both in this country. If you choose to raise your kid homeschooled, that is your choice. You should have the ability to make it. You want to be more involved in the raising and upbringing of your kid? Who the fuck is the government to tell you that you shouldn't do it and they will? What is our government, like any government, really ever been great at? Can we rename Earth Shit Show? I mean, it's a good nickname. It can be that'll be the technical term. That'll be our new technical term for Earth. I like it. But, I mean, I don't have a single example of a government throughout all of history that you could point to and be like, you know what, they do really great at raising kids. Not one. In fact, when they were talking in this article about, was it in here? Some are taught using the classics of ancient Greece, others with Nazi propaganda. What do you think 1930s and 1940s German public schools did? But let the government public schools teach your kids. The government can be trusted, right? Like, this is clearly not that government here. But you're going to tell me that the government that had the intelligence agencies tell you that there were weapons of mass destruction all over Iraq and that we had to go get them, and then never turned out any single piece of footage saying, hey, look what we found in Iraq after sending your kids to die in Iraq. You think that government's going to do great at raising your kids? You think they have their best interest at heart? Most governments look at your child as future revenue, future voter, a burden on society if they don't contribute, or cannon fodder for their wars. I don't think that that's the hill you really want to die on as who should be in charge of teaching and raising children. The government is not who you want in charge of this, and that's all public schools are. It is a government school. And the government has done a shit job of everything they've ran in this country. The government here does a really good job at war. And they haven't done a good job at war since they went from the Ministry of War, because we used to actually have like a Department of War that was led by the Minister of War. And then World War II came to an end, and we were like, we're going to change it over to the Department of Defense. And we're not good at defense. We're good at war. I don't know what else our government's really good at. We're good at making shit, but that's not the government. Our government's really good at blowing things up and sending people like me to dispense freedom seeds. Okay? Like, that's it. That's what they're good at. I'd stop thinking they're going to do better with your children than you. Nobody's going to do it perfect. But I mean, the outcome of trusting the government to do it can, at worst, actually be this. Which they're blaming parents for. They're saying parents are the ones who do this, and not people teaching schools in a public school in, I don't know, 1930, 1940 Germany. 1940s little villages and towns all across South America where these legitimate individuals from this organization had established their new society, which many of which you can still go to today and find them doing things like Beer Fest and Oktoberfest in full German regalia and clothing as blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people with European architecture in these towns that popped up in the 1940s and 50s. I wonder how the fuck that happened, huh? All across South America. I wonder what those public schools teach. What about the public schools that are teaching your kids Mandarin and Russian? Why does your kid need to know Mandarin and Russian in America? How often do you come across someone speaking Mandarin? I'm more likely to come across somebody speaking Dari, which is an Islamic dialect. It's the most common Islamic dialect, I believe. I could be wrong because it's a very, very huge population of people. But I believe that is the most common dialect of Muslim speech. I'm more likely to come across that here than I am Mandarin or Russian. But here we are. Send your kids to public schools so that they can learn Mandarin and Russian, or more popularly in most public schools, Spanish, which is actually useful in America, or French, which is historically relevant, and I guess useful if you're going to Canada. But if you're going to Canada and they're all speaking French, you're in the wrong part of Canada. On that, though, I'm done rambling about it.